The night my mother told me not to come for Christmas, her words cut deeper than she knew. "We'll celebrate with your brother instead." I thought silence would be my punishment to bear alone. Until the party, when Ethan's girlfriend looked at my photo on their mantel and went pale. In that instant, she remembered me not as the daughter they erased, but as the doctor who once saved her grandmother's life. That night, the laughter in their house died, and for the first time the truth spoke louder than all of them. Snow drifted against the window panes, soft and quiet, as if Boston itself was holding its breath. My apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine from the small tree I had set up in the corner. It wasn't lavish, just a string of white lights and a few ornaments I had collected over the years, but it made the space feel warm in the bitter cold of December. I stood in the middle of my living room, wrapping the last of the gifts with steady hands, each one chosen with a kind of hope I didn't want to admit out loud. For Mom, a wool scarf in a soft gray she liked to wear in winter. For Dad, a book about retirement planning. I had seen him browsing one at the library months ago. And for Ethan, my younger brother, a professional set of paints, even though the last time I gave him anything resembling art supplies, he laughed and called my gifts soulless. I wrapped them anyway, smoothing down the paper and taping the corners neatly. I looked around the apartment, the suitcase already half-packed by the door, my green sweater laid out on the couch. It was a forest shade, understated but festive, the kind of thing you wear when you want to look like you're trying just enough. I imagined myself stepping into the familiar chaos of my parents' house in Newton's snow boots, left at the front door, the smell of roasted turkey filling the air. My mother smiling, my father pouring wine, Ethan cracking jokes from the couch. Maybe, just maybe, this year would feel normal. This year might be different. My phone rang, pulling me from the daydream. The name flashing on the screen made me smile without thinking. Ethan. Maybe he was calling to coordinate rides, maybe to ask if I could bring extra napkins or pie. Something normal, something brotherly. I answered with a light tone. "Hey." "Hey," he said back, stretching the word out. He always used that casual voice when he wanted to slip something in, like putting sugar over a bitter pill. "So listen." The silence that followed made my chest tighten. "What's going on?" I asked. He cleared his throat. "Sienna's coming to Christmas. You know my girlfriend, she's really sensitive about energy. The vibe of a room, you know?" And well, I waited. "With your work it's just heavy. Olivia, you're always dealing with sickness and hospitals. It's a lot. For her. I just think maybe it would be better if you sat this one out. Nothing personal." My hand froze around the phone. My heart thudded, but I couldn't find words. I wanted to remind him I was the one who made the rosemary stuffing every single year. That I had already bought her a gift, even though I had met her only once in passing. Instead, I heard myself say, "Okay." He sighed, relieved. "Thanks for understanding. It's just 1 year. You know how it is." We hung up. I stared at the silent phone in my hand, the knot in my chest spreading outward. Before I could put it down, it lit up again. "Mom." I swallowed and answered. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was soft, the kind she used when she was about to deliver something sharp. "Honey, I just spoke with your brother. We're trying to make things easy for everyone this year. Sienna's very special to him and he wants everything to go perfectly. So," she hesitated for only a second before saying it, "don't come for Christmas. We'll celebrate with your brother instead. He needs this more." For a moment, all I could hear was the faint whistle of the radiator in my apartment. Snow tapped against the glass. My pulse pounded in my ears. "I see I managed." "It's not that we don't love you," she rushed in. "We just want to avoid confusion. You know how sensitive things can be. I wanted to ask how my presence could confuse anyone. I wanted to ask how a daughter could be erased from her own family's table because her brother had someone new to impress." But the words never made it past my lips. My throat felt tight, my tongue heavy. "Okay," I said. "Just one word." When we hung up, I stood there in the middle of my living room, the silence around me louder than anything. My gift sat stacked neatly on the coffee table, the green sweater folded with care, the suitcase ready by the door. I had been prepared to drive through the snow to join in the laughter to carve the turkey. Instead, the only sound in the room was the creak of the radiator and the muffled hum of traffic below. My fingers trembled slightly as I set the phone down. That single sentence, "We'll celebrate with your brother instead," kept echoing, growing sharper with every replay in my mind. I sank down onto the couch, staring at the twinkling lights on the tree, each bulb flickering like a reminder of something slipping away. My chest ached. My stomach churned, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel the full weight of it. The rejection wasn't subtle this time. It wasn't hidden behind jokes or quiet dismissals. It was direct, spoken, final. And just like that, the fragile hope I had wrapped around myself unraveled thread by thread, leaving me alone in the dim glow of the apartment while the snow kept falling outside. The glow from the Christmas tree blurred as I sat motionless, my eyes fixed on the soft white lights that seemed to pulse with every breath I took. They felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's home. My chest felt hollow, but my mind, traitorous as ever, reached back, pulling me through time to the places I didn't want to revisit but always carried with me. I was 10 years old again, standing in our kitchen with a certificate in my hand. First place in the district math competition. My teacher had patted me on the shoulder, telling me I had a sharp mind, that I could do anything I wanted. I had walked into the house that day, believing for a brief moment that maybe my parents would see me, that maybe they would pin the paper up on the fridge like they did Ethan's stick figure drawings from kindergarten. Instead, Mom glanced at it, muttered a distracted, "That's nice, honey," and slipped it into the drawer by the phone. By the end of the week, it was buried under old grocery lists and expired coupons. A week later, Ethan took a marker and scrawled across the living room wall. Loops and swirls, nothing but chaos. Dad laughed, clapped him on the back, and said, "Look at that! Our little artist." Mom shook her head with a smile, grabbed the camera, and snapped a picture as if it was a masterpiece. The permanent stain stayed on the wall for years, a badge of his creativity. My certificate was long gone. I thought of dinners at the old oak table, the one that groaned when you leaned your elbows on it. I used to sit with a book propped against my glass of milk, my nose buried in words. "You're too serious," Olivia, Mom would chide, plucking the book from my hands. "Lighten up. You'll make yourself old before your time." Ethan would respond by throwing peas across the table or making faces with mashed potatoes, and the room would erupt in laughter. My father's voice deep, warm with pride. "That's my boy. Always the life of the party." The memories piled on heavy as wet snow. Every time Ethan stumbled, they cushioned his fall. When I soared, they acted as though it were nothing but wind. I remembered the time I came home with a perfect report card. Straight A's, not a single blemish. I left it on the kitchen counter on purpose, right by the coffee maker where Mom couldn't miss it. By nightfall, it had been moved, folded into the recycling bin under pizza boxes and newspapers. Meanwhile, Ethan brought home a participation ribbon from field day, 5th place in a relay race, and it hung proudly on the fridge for a week. He strutted every morning, grabbing orange juice, pointing at it like he'd won the Olympics. No one ever asked me about my grades. No one ever asked me about the stories I read or the sketches I left in my notebooks. Even my art wasn't spared. Once I'd drawn a quiet scene of a girl under a lamppost pencil, shaded so carefully it took me hours. I left it on the coffee table, hoping someone would see. A day later, I found it crumpled in the recycling bin beneath coupons. When I asked, Mom shrugged. I thought it was scrap paper. The sting still burned even now, decades later. The lights on my tree flickered, and I closed my eyes, trying to still the ache in my throat. I told myself it hadn't mattered that I had built a life away from their blind spots. But the truth sat raw in me. I had spent 36 years trying to be noticed by people who had decided from the beginning that Ethan was the sun and I was just his shadow. It wasn't only about pride, it was about presence. In every photo on the mantel, Ethan's smile was the center, my blurred figure off to the side. In every family gathering, his stories were the ones retold, mine forgotten before the dessert was cleared. They didn't even see it as cruelty. It was simply the air they breathed, the rhythm of their love. I remembered the way Dad once said, "Ethan just has something special. People are drawn to him." I wanted to ask, "And what about me?" But I never did. I folded the question down as tightly as I folded my laundry, tucked it away where no one could see. The silence of my apartment pressed in thick and unforgiving. Outside, a car slid cautiously down the snowy street, its headlights cutting briefly through my window. The sound grounded me, pulled me back to the present, but the weight of the past lingered. I rose from the couch and walked to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I looked out at the snow. For a moment, I could almost see my younger self standing there holding out that math certificate, eyes shining with hope. And then I saw her hand lower the light fade when no one cared. My fingers curled into fists at my sides. That little girl had grown into a woman who could cut open a chest, steady her hands through the chaos of surgery, fight to keep someone's grandmother breathing. I had spent years proving my worth in rooms full of strangers, because at home worth was something I was never allowed to hold. The tree behind me blinked once more, soft and quiet. I turned back the warmth of the lights, brushing against the ache inside me. And with a clarity that surprised me, I admitted the truth I had been pushing down for years. I had never been invisible. They had chosen not to see me. The realization settled heavy but sharp like a blade pressed against skin. It cut away the last of my excuses, left nothing but the raw truth. I had been erased not by accident but by design. The room seemed quieter in that moment, the radiator hissing softly in the background, the snow falling steady outside. I sat back down on the couch, letting the silence settle around me, feeling the truth harden into something I could no longer deny. I wasn't just left out of Christmas. I had been left out of my family all along. The cursor blinked on the screen of my laptop, steady and indifferent, while I stared at the numbers stacked in neat rows. The balances, the monthly withdrawals, the silent river of money I had been sending to my parents for years, without a thank you. Mortgage support. A car repair card, old loans they had promised to repay, but never mentioned again. I scrolled down each line, reminding me of the ways I had carried them. Ways they never even acknowledged. My hand hovered over the auto-pay settings. The button was small, almost unremarkable, but I knew the weight behind it. One click and the invisible lifeline I had kept flowing into their lives would dry up. My breath caught in my throat. The guilt rose first, a reflex I couldn't suppress. What if the furnace broke again this winter? What if Dad's car stalled on Route 9 in the snow? What if they couldn't make the mortgage without my silent deposits? But then the memory of Mom's voice came back to me, soft but sharp. "Don't come for Christmas. We'll celebrate with your brother instead." I could almost hear Ethan laughing in the background, carefree as ever, while my chest tightened. They hadn't thought twice about cutting me out. Why was I breaking myself to keep them warm? I pressed the key. A window popped up. "Are you sure you want to cancel this payment?" I clicked, "Yes." Another window. "Are you sure?" I clicked again. The screen refreshed and the line disappeared. It was gone. The silence in the apartment thickened. My pulse thundered as I canceled the car fund, then the emergency savings account I had kept for them. Each click was a slice, painful but precise. By the time I was finished, my hands trembled. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms to my face. The guilt hadn't vanished, but underneath it was something sharper, relief. I stood and walked to the small Christmas tree in the corner, its lights twinkling oblivious. I pulled the plug from the socket, and the apartment fell darker. The ornaments glinted faintly in the dim light from the street outside. Without the glow, the tree looked bare, almost sad, like a promise broken. On the coffee table, the neatly wrapped gifts stared back at me. The gray scarf for Mom, the retirement book for Dad, the art supplies for Ethan. I lifted each one, the paper smooth and cold under my fingers, and carried them to the closet. I placed them on the highest shelf and closed the door as if sealing away a part of myself I no longer wanted to offer. The green sweater lay folded on the couch. I picked it up, held it against me for a moment, then set it back down. I walked to the window and pulled the curtains shut, blocking out the pale glow of the streetlights. The room sank into shadow. For a long time I stood there listening to the hum of the radiator and the muffled wind against the glass. My chest ached, but in the ache was a clarity I hadn't known before. I had always been the one to fix, to provide, to step in before anyone even asked. They never noticed until something broke. Now I would let it break. I whispered into the silence, not sure if I was speaking to myself or to the ghost of every Christmas I had tried to salvage. They'll notice when I'm gone. They'll finally see how much I mattered. The words hung in the dark, like a vow. The radiator clicked, the pipes hissed, the snow outside kept falling. I sank onto the couch, my arms wrapped around the green sweater, and closed my eyes. The house was quiet, but inside me something had shifted. They had shut me out of Christmas. I would shut off the pieces of myself they had always taken for granted. And when the silence finally reached them, it wouldn't be me who felt small. It would be them. The phone lit up on the nightstand again, buzzing against the wood, the name Mom glowing on the screen. I let it ring until it went silent. Then it rang again. And again. By the fourth call, I turned the phone face down and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint rush of traffic outside, but the vibration of the phone seemed to pulse through the room. When it finally stopped, I exhaled. A few minutes later, the screen lit up once more, this time with a different name. Aunt Sharon. I hesitated before answering. Her voice came through low, almost tentative. Olivia. Hi, Aunt Sharon. My throat was tight. I just need to ask, what happened yesterday? My stomach flipped. What do you mean? She sighed. Your mom called me this morning. She said you ruined Christmas. I laughed before I could stop myself, a short, bitter sound. I ruined Christmas. I wasn't even there. I know, she said quickly. That's why I'm confused. They're telling people you caused a scene, that you said hurtful things, but you weren't even at the house, were you? No, I said flatly. I wasn't. There was a pause, then she lowered her voice. They said when Sienna walked in and saw your photo on the bookshelf, the room went quiet. She excused herself and left early. Afterward, everyone was upset. And then, well, the story turned into you being the reason the night fell apart. My hand tightened around the phone. My picture caused a scandal, I guess so. But that's not all. She hesitated. They're saying you've always been jealous of Ethan, that you've talked badly about him for years, that you resent him. The words stung not because they were new, but because they were so practiced, like lines in a play my family had performed for decades. The scapegoat script. Olivia is difficult. Olivia is bitter. Olivia ruins the mood. I let out a shaky breath. So now I'm the villain, even in absentia. Sweetheart, I don't believe it, Sharon said softly. I just thought you should know what's being said. Thank you for telling me, I whispered. After we hung up, I sat in the stillness, the phone heavy in my lap. My photo, just a frame on a shelf, had been enough to unravel the carefully curated holiday. And somehow that was my fault. Somehow I was the chaos even when I wasn't present. I pictured the scene: Sienna standing in front of the mantel, her glass of wine in hand, her eyes catching on the photo of me at graduation. The laughter fading, the sudden silence, her expression shifting as she put the glass down. The shuffle of chairs, the awkward clearing of throats, and then her leaving the door clicking shut behind her. And in the void, she left my family, did what they always did. They looked for a name to pin their discomfort on. They found mine. I pressed the phone to my chest and leaned back against the couch. The ache in me wasn't surprise, it was recognition. This was the role I had always been assigned, the scapegoat, the easy target. If Ethan tripped, I was the one who had distracted him. If Mom burned the casserole, it was because I had stressed her out. Now, if Christmas imploded, it was because I hadn't been there to smile and nod and make everyone else feel comfortable. I let out another laugh, softer this time, almost hollow. There was something grotesquely funny about being blamed for a night I spent alone in my apartment in the dark, clutching a green sweater I never wore. The radiator hissed, filling the silence. I rose and walked to the closet, pulling the gifts back into view. I looked at the scarf for Mom, the book for Dad, the paints for Ethan. I touched the edges of the wrapping paper and felt the sting of tears behind my eyes. These had been my way of saying I still belonged, even if they pretended not to see me. And now, even wrapped, they were evidence against me, proof I cared too much about people who would never care enough in return. I slid the closet door shut again and leaned against it. The laughter from childhood dinners, the dismissals of my achievements, the endless praise for Ethan. It all condensed into this one moment. Even my absence couldn't free me. They would twist the story until it fit their narrative, and in that story I would always be the problem. My chest ached, but beneath the ache was a sharper edge, almost like clarity. If they could cast me as the villain while I sat quietly miles away, maybe it wasn't me who was broken. Maybe it was the story they had been telling themselves all along. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and turned off the last of the lights in the apartment. The city outside was muffled under snow, the world softened, but inside me the truth rang clear. I hadn't been invited and still I was blamed. I was their scapegoat whether I showed up or not. I remembered the spring of 2014, the day I walked across the stage at Tufts. My cap tight against my head, the tassel brushing my cheek as they called my name. Years of exhaustion and study had finally coalesced into that single moment, the M.D. after my name. My classmates hugged their parents afterward, took photos with flowers and balloons. My parents showed up late, stood stiffly for one photo, and by the time I tried to hand Mom the program with my name in print, she only said, "Just be careful you don't burn out. Medicine can eat people alive, no congratulations, no pride, just a warning as though my achievement was a liability." Meanwhile, Ethan had been floundering through his third year at NYU. He changed majors 3 times, drifting from photography to film studies to communications, before finally dropping out that fall. When he came home, they threw him a welcome back party in the living room. There were balloons tied to the chairs, a banner strung up across the fireplace that read, "New Beginnings, Neighbors Invited Over to Toast to His Brave Decision to Find His True Calling." I didn't go. I worked a late shift at the hospital, then came home to find the photos posted online. Ethan grinning with his arm around Dad, Mom beaming at his side like he'd just been accepted into NASA. A year later, in 2015, I published my first research paper in a major medical journal. An early intervention strategy for Alzheimer's patients. I had poured everything into it, months of patient interviews, long nights at the lab revisions so precise I could have recited every line in my sleep. I brought a copy home, laid it on the dining table beside the salt shaker, and waited for someone to notice. That night, no one mentioned it. Mom asked me to pass the potatoes Dad complained about the Red Sox bullpen, and Ethan talked about a new series of abstract paintings he was working on. The next day, my paper was gone from the table. Later, I found it shoved between a pile of unopened mail. 2 weeks later, Ethan unveiled one of those paintings in the living room. It was nothing more than thick black streaks cutting across a red canvas, the kind of thing you'd see in a first-year studio class. They hung it above the fireplace front and center, and Dad bragged to the mailman about Ethan's eye for color. Every guest who visited was ushered toward it. "Look what our son created." I stopped leaving anything of mine out. It wasn't just the big milestones. It was in the small comments, too. At every family dinner, Mom's eyes would cut to me when I answered too seriously about my work. "Lighten up, Olivia. You're too intense. You'll scare people off." When Ethan interrupted spinning half-baked ideas about art collectives and redefining the visual landscape, She'd smile, shake her head fondly, and say, "He just feels things so deeply. Dad was worse." He'd put his arm around Ethan and say, "This is the one we're investing in. He's got vision." To me, he only asked about loan repayment, reminded me to be practical. When I once asked why they never came to the hospital open house where I presented our research, he said, "That stuff is too technical for us. We wouldn't understand anyway." I thought about all the times I'd watched Ethan stumble each time caught by the safety net of their praise. When he maxed out a credit card at 21, Dad called it a learning experience. When I was late with one utility bill during residency, Mom scolded me for being irresponsible. The longer I sat with these memories, the clearer the picture became. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a wall brick by brick built from every slight, every dismissal, every celebration of Ethan's mediocrity. I had spent years trying to climb it, throwing my accomplishments against it like stones, hoping one would finally break through. But the wall never cracked. It only grew higher. I remembered walking into their house once in 2016, exhausted after a double shift still in scrubs, my hair pulled back in a mess. Ethan was sprawled on the couch, paint under his fingernails, Mom bringing him a plate of cookies like he was 12. She looked at me and said, "You should smile more, Olivia. You always look so weighed down." I had smiled anyway. Lips tight, teeth clenched, and gone upstairs to the room that used to be mine, now filled with canvases and turpentine. My old desk was gone, my books boxed up in the basement. The air smelled of oil paint. I sat on the edge of the bed that no longer existed and told myself not to cry. That night I had driven back to my apartment with a hollow ache in my chest, telling myself maybe I was overreacting. Maybe all families had blind spots. But now, years later, staring into the dark of my own living room, I saw it clearly. It wasn't me they couldn't see. It was that they chose not to. They had written me out of their story long ago, and no amount of success could wedge me back in. The truth landed like a stone in my stomach. I had built a life, a career, a reputation in the outside world. But at home, I was still the girl with the math certificate buried under coupons while my brother's scribbles hung on the wall. And in that moment, I understood I had never stood a chance against the wall of favoritism they had built around Ethan. It had been standing there my entire life, and I had finally stopped trying to break it. The voicemail icon blinked on my phone screen, a tiny red dot pulsing like a heartbeat. I almost ignored it. After the avalanche of missed calls and whispers about Christmas, I wasn't sure I had the strength for one more reminder. But curiosity got the better of me, and I pressed play. The voice that filled the room wasn't the airy, carefully curated tone I'd heard in Ethan's photos and videos. It was smaller, shaky, stripped of the gloss that usually wrapped around her like perfume. "Hi, this is Sienna. I'm sorry to reach out like this. I got your number from your aunt." A pause, heavy, almost embarrassed. "I recognized your picture. It took me a second, but then I knew. You treated my grandmother Elma back in 2018. She still talks about you all the time." I froze. "She always remembers what you said to her." Sienna continued. Her voice caught a hitch in her throat. "You're not done yet. That's what you told her. She repeats it like a mantra when she gets scared." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, my throat burning. I could see Elma's face again, lined with years, but full of a stubborn light gripping my hand as I adjusted her oxygen. I had said those words without thinking, trying to keep her calm. But hearing them back now from someone else's lips made me ache in a way I hadn't expected. "I didn't know who you were when I agreed to go to that Christmas dinner," Sienna went on. "I just knew what they told me, that you were cold, difficult, hard to be around. But when I saw your picture, I couldn't pretend anymore. I heard the jokes they made about you, the way they laughed, and I felt sick. I couldn't stay. I left because I couldn't stand how they talked about someone who meant that much to my grandmother, who had been that kind to her." Her voice softened further. "I'm sorry. I just wanted you to know. You mattered. You made a difference. Even if they don't see it, I do." The message ended with a click. I sat there on my couch, the phone heavy in my hand. For a long time I didn't move. The silence in the room was so deep I could hear the faint creak of the radiator, the tick of the clock on the wall. Then the tears came sudden and unrelenting. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapped my arms around a pillow, and pressed my face into the fabric. The sobs shook out of me in waves I couldn't control. I wasn't crying out of sadness. Not entirely. It was the release of being seen, really seen, without having to beg for it. Recognition that came not from the people who were supposed to give it, but from a stranger who owed me nothing. A stranger who had walked into my family's house, into their web of half-truths and dismissals, and chosen to leave rather than join in the cruelty. The pillow grew damp under my cheek, smelling faintly of laundry soap. My chest ached, but beneath the ache was something fierce. A flicker of validation that cut through years of silence. I thought of Ethan, of Mom and Dad spinning their stories, rewriting history in real time so that I was always the problem. And then I thought of Sienna, her voice trembling as she admitted she couldn't pretend. She had no reason to reach out. She could have stayed quiet, preserved her relationship with Ethan, ignored me completely. Instead, she chose the harder path. The weight of that choice pressed into me. It meant more than any apology my family could ever offer. I set the phone down and leaned back against the couch, wiping my face with the sleeve of my sweater. The room still felt dark, but something inside me had shifted like a small light had been lit in the center of my chest. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was screaming into a void. Someone had heard me even when I hadn't spoken. The radiator hissed again, the heat rising against the cold outside. I pulled the pillow closer, curling into it as the tears finally slowed. My breathing evened out, each inhale steadier than the last. For so long I had believed my family's story about me, that I was too serious, too cold, too difficult to love. But hearing Sienna's voice, remembering Elma's eyes as she gripped my hand, I realized there was another story, one they could never erase because it didn't belong to them. It belonged to the people I had helped, the lives I had touched when no one else would. And now it belonged to me too. I closed my eyes, the echo of Sienna's words still circling in my mind. You mattered. The snow outside kept falling steady and relentless, covering everything in silence. Inside my apartment, for the first time in a long time, the silence felt like something else. It felt like proof. The notification popped up while I was charting notes at the hospital that a coworker leaned over, phone in hand, whispering, "Hey, isn't this your brother's girlfriend?" I frowned, took the phone and read. Sienna's words filled the screen in long, unflinching paragraphs. She wrote about her grandmother, about how a young doctor had sat by her bedside in 2018 when every other physician had suggested hospice, how that doctor had leaned close and said, "You're not done yet," and then fought for her when no one else would. She described how her grandmother still walked to the market, still did yoga twice a week, still repeated those words whenever she felt fear creeping in. Then Sienna shifted. She wrote about Christmas Eve, about walking into a house glowing with lights and decorations, expecting warmth, only to hear the family make jokes at that very doctor's expense. They laughed, she wrote. They made her sound cold, clinical, unlovable. They turned her into a caricature. And I couldn't sit there pretending. I read every word twice, my hands trembling. She didn't name me, but she didn't have to. Anyone who knew my family would know. By noon, the post had racked up hundreds of likes. By evening, thousands. Comments poured in from artists, photographers, curators, people I'd never met but who seemed to know Sienna well. They called her brave for leaving. They called my family toxic. They wrote about kindness, about integrity, about how real artistry was measured in character, not just canvas. The next morning, my inbox lit up with a message forwarded from a colleague, an announcement from Patrick Lane, a gallery owner in Soho. Due to recent revelations, we are discontinuing all upcoming shows with Ethan Hayes. We do not collaborate with individuals who demonstrate disrespect in their personal lives. I stared at the words on my screen, my heart pounding. Ethan's golden image, the one my parents had polished and protected for years, was cracking in real time. Not because of me. Because of the truth. By the end of the week, more doors closed. A collective withdrew an offer. A freelance contract evaporated. I didn't gloat. I just sat with the surreal weight of watching someone finally held accountable by the same outside world that had always applauded him. Then the email came. The subject line, "Let's reset things." It was addressed to me, CC'd to both my parents and Ethan. The message began with a forced cheerfulness. Emotions ran high over the holiday, and we all regret how things may have been perceived. We think everyone would benefit from a fresh start. The next paragraph proposed a family brunch at a neutral cafe in Cambridge. "Will come with open hearts," it read. But further down, buried in the third paragraph, was the real ask. "We would appreciate if you reached out to Sienna and clarified that there was no bad intention. If she could take down her post, it would help restore peace for everyone." I leaned back in my chair, the fluorescent hospital lights buzzing above me. Peace. That was what they called it. Not apology, not accountability, just peace, so long as their reputations were spared. I imagined the conversation around their dining table, Mom pacing Dad, pouring his crisis glass of wine. Ethan hunched and sulking, all of them, drafting this email like it was a group project. They hadn't written to me to ask how I was to acknowledge what they had done. They had written because the story had slipped out of their control. I read the email again slower this time and found myself smiling. It wasn't joy, it wasn't triumph. It was a bitter, almost hollow amusement. For decades I had been invisible in their eyes. Now suddenly I mattered, because their image did. I closed the laptop without replying. The sound of it snapping shut echoed louder than it should have, like punctuation at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. For the first time, it was clear to them family wasn't love. It was a performance. And now their performance was unraveling in front of an audience they couldn't charm. The call from the hospital came while I was finishing rounds. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my white coat, and when I saw the number on the screen, I thought it was another patient consult. Instead, it was Dr. Linda Foster, the hospital administrator. Her voice was calm but carried a strain I hadn't heard before. "Olivia, do you have a minute to talk privately?" I stepped into an empty supply room, closing the door behind me. "Of course. What's going on?" She hesitated. "I received a call this morning from a man identifying himself as your father, Richard Hayes. He claimed he was concerned about your emotional stability. He suggested you've been acting erratically, that you might need supervision." The words hit like ice water down my back. "What I want you to know," she continued quickly, "that I documented everything and informed HR as protocol requires. But I also want you to understand, I don't believe a word of it. Your record here is impeccable. It just shocked me to hear a parent say something like that about their own daughter." I leaned against the shelf. My hand pressed hard against the cold metal. My father calling my workplace, trying to paint me as unstable. My career, my life's work, was the one thing they couldn't take from me. And he had gone for it anyway. "Thank you for telling me," I said, my voice tight. "I appreciate your professionalism." After we hung up, I stood in the small room staring at the shelves stacked with gauze and IV bags. My pulse was still hammering. The betrayal had always been emotional, personal, but this was different. This was calculated. If they couldn't erase me from the family, they would smear me in the world I had built for myself. By the time I got home that night, the ripple effects had already begun. My phone buzzed with messages from distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. One read, "We're so worried about you. If you need to get away, we have a yoga retreat voucher you can use. Maybe some time in nature will help." Another said, "Don't let stress consume you, Olivia. Family can be hard, but don't destroy yourself over it." I laughed out loud, the sound sharp and bitter in my empty apartment. A yoga retreat. As if all it would take to erase decades of dismissal and cruelty was a few sun salutations in the woods. I scrolled further and found a message from a cousin in Chicago. Your mom said you lashed out on Christmas, that you've been carrying anger for years. I hope you find peace. I set the phone down before I threw it. So that was the story now. I hadn't been absent. I had been unstable. I hadn't been cut out. I had lashed out. The lies slid neatly into place, like a script they'd been rehearsing for years. And the family, ever eager for drama, ate it up without question. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the surface cluttered with unopened mail and the green sweater I hadn't worn. The overhead light flickered once, casting the room in brief shadow. I thought of my father on the phone with Dr. Foster, using the same steady tone he'd once used to balance the family checkbook. Calm, rational, weaponizing concern. I imagined my mother's hand on his arm as he dialed her nod of approval. I imagined Ethan smirking, relieved to have the spotlight shifted back away from him, if only for a moment. The image burned in my mind until my jaw ached from clenching it. The truth was undeniable now. They would stop at nothing to protect him, even if it meant destroying me. My reputation, my career, the one thing I had fought for without their help. They were willing to drag it through the mud just to keep Ethan's halo from slipping. I stood and walked to the closet, pulling the wrapped gifts back into the light. My fingers traced the edge of the paper, neat and perfect. They looked ridiculous now, almost mocking. I carried them to the trash and dropped them in one by one. The hollow thud of each box against the plastic bag echoed through the apartment. When the last one was gone, I leaned against the counter, breathing hard. My eyes stung, but I didn't cry. Instead, I felt something else settling in me, heavier but steadier, a recognition I couldn't ignore. They weren't just blind to me. They weren't just cruel. They were willing to burn my name to the ground if it meant keeping Ethan aloft. And if that was true, then the daughter they claimed to love had never existed at all. Not in their eyes, not in their story. The radiator hissed again, the heat pushing against the cold of the Boston winter. But I felt a chill seep deeper than the snow outside. I wrapped my arms around myself and stood in the dim kitchen, the silence stretching long. I had lost count of the times I told myself they couldn't go further, that there was a line they wouldn't cross. Tonight, I learned there was no line at all. The knock came just after 3 on a gray Sunday afternoon. At first, I thought it was the upstairs neighbor again, complaining about the radiator clanging. But when I looked through the peephole, my breath caught. Mom. Dad and Ethan stood there, bundled in coats, snowflakes clinging to their sleeves. For a long moment, I considered not opening the door. My hand hovered on the knob, my heart hammering in my chest. But something in me wanted to hear what they would say when forced to look me in the eye. I pulled the door open and leaned against the frame. "We just want to talk," Mom said quickly, her breath clouding in the cold. Her eyes darted past me into the apartment as if searching for signs of what kind of life I led without them. I stepped back. "Fine." They shuffled inside, shaking snow from their shoes, the air carrying the sharp scent of Dad's aftershave and Ethan's cigarettes. They sat stiffly on my couch, their posture rehearsed as though they'd planned every word on the drive over. Dad went first, his voice firm, clipped. "We raised you, Olivia. We paid for everything growing up. You wouldn't be where you are without us. You owe us." Mom reached for a softer angle. "Enough is enough. Families fight, but forgiveness is what matters. We've made mistakes, but you've punished us long enough." Ethan leaned forward, his knee bouncing, his face tense. "This is about Sienna. You need to help me get her back. She won't return my calls. She blocks me on everything. She'll listen to you. You're the reason she left." The air in the room thickened. Their words fell like accusations, demands, justifications. My pulse slowed, steady and deliberate, as though my body had already decided how this scene would end. I didn't answer them right away. Instead, I rose, walked to my desk, and pulled open the bottom drawer. The folder was thick, overstuffed with years of receipts, printouts, and bank transfers. I carried it back to the coffee table and laid it down in front of them, the sound sharp in the silence. They watched me warily as I spread the papers out one by one. copies of mortgage payments from 2015 through 2022, each one stamped with my name on the account. A receipt for a $3,000 dental surgery Dad had needed in 2019, the credit card slip signed in my hand. Notes from car repairs, house maintenance, furnace checks. All the invisible scaffolding I had built beneath their lives. You want to talk about what I owe? My voice was calm, but it cut through the room like glass. I tapped the stack of papers. Here's what you owe. Every month, every emergency, every time you couldn't or wouldn't cover your own expenses. I carried it, quietly, for years. Dad's face flushed, his jaw tightening. That's not the point. It's exactly the point I interrupted. My hand hovered over the receipts like evidence laid out in a courtroom. When Ethan maxed out his cards, you called it a lesson. When you needed new tires, I paid without complaint. But when I achieved anything, you dismissed it. When I asked for recognition, you ignored it. And now you stand in my apartment demanding I repair the damage you created. Mom's voice trembled. We're family. That's what family does. They help each other. I looked at her, then really looked. The lines around her mouth had deepened, her eyes darting with unease. I could almost hear her rehearsing this argument in her head, believing it would sound convincing. Family, I said quietly. Family doesn't erase one child to glorify another. Family doesn't laugh at the daughter who saves lives while they hang the son's mess on the wall like art. Family doesn't call her employer to smear her name. Ethan scoffed. You're being dramatic. Sienna dumped me because she thinks you're some kind of saint. You poisoned her against me. I almost laughed. You really believe that? That she left because I tricked her? She left because she saw the truth. She saw you mock the doctor who saved her grandmother's life, and she decided she wanted no part of it. His face went pale, his jaw working, but no words forming. I leaned back, folding my arms across my chest. You want me to fix this? You want me to make her forgive you, to smooth everything over so you can keep playing golden boy. But I'm not your safety net anymore. I'm not your scapegoat. Not your ATM. Not your silence. The room fell into a heavy stillness. Snow tapped against the window. The radiator hissed, but no one spoke. I gathered the papers back into the folder, stacked them neatly, and placed them on my lap. Finally, I met their eyes one by one. You want to talk about debts? I could calculate interest if you'd like. Dad looked away, red creeping up his neck. Mom's lips trembled, her hands twisting together. Ethan dropped his gaze to the floor, shoulders slumping. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one shrinking under their judgment. They were the ones shrinking under mine. And sitting there in the dim light of my apartment, I felt the shift settle into place. I was no longer the child begging to be seen. I was the one holding the ledger. Ethan shot up from the couch, his voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. She left me because of you. Don't act like you don't know it. She's still in love with you. That's why she walked out. I didn't flinch. I held his gaze steady, unshaken. No, Ethan. She left because she saw you. She heard you make jokes about me, about my work, about the patients whose lives I hold in my hands. She left because you mocked the doctor who saved her grandmother's life. And once she saw that she couldn't unsee it, the words dropped between us like stones into a frozen pond rippling out in the stillness. Dad shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing before he turned his face away. He didn't want to watch his son unravel. Mom pressed her lips together, her eyes glassy as though tears might break through if she dared to blink. Ethan opened his mouth once, twice, but no sound came. He stood frozen, jaw clenched, his whole frame trembling. I rose to my feet. My hands no longer shook my shoulders, no longer sagged. I felt taller than I had in years, even in my own living room. Let me make something clear, I said, my voice cutting through the air with finality. I'm done. No more money. No more forgiveness. No more silence. Mom's breath hitched. Olivia, please? I shook my head. No. For 36 years I gave and you took. You dismissed me, erased me, blamed me, and then came crawling back only when your world started to crack. That cycle ends tonight." The radiator clicked loudly as though punctuating my words. For a long moment, no one moved. The three of them sat there like statues weighed down by something heavier than pride. Ethan's eyes darted, searching for an argument, a lifeline, but finding nothing. Dad's hands gripped his knees, the veins in his knuckles pale and strained. Mom's fingers twisted in her lap, trembling. Finally, Dad stood, clearing his throat. "Come on," he muttered, his voice low, almost hoarse. He wouldn't look at me. Mom followed, her eyes still wet, glancing once toward me before dropping to the floor. Ethan lingered for a moment, his jaw tight, but when I didn't move, he grabbed his coat from the arm of the chair and shoved his arms into the sleeves. He muttered something under his breath, too quiet to hear, then turned away. I stood rooted to the floor as they filed out. The sound of the door clicking shut behind them was softer than I expected, almost anticlimactic. But the weight of it settled over the room. The apartment was still. The papers I had laid out earlier were stacked neatly again, waiting on the coffee table like silent witnesses. My hands rested at my sides, steady, calm. For the first time, there was no urge to run after them, no ache to call them back, no desperate scramble to repair what they had broken. Through the window, the sky was already dark, the street below coated with new snow. I walked over, placed my hand on the cold glass, and let my breath fog the surface. Out there, cars passed, people carried grocery bags, life went on. Inside, I stood in the quiet aftermath of a battle I hadn't even realized I'd been waiting for. I turned back toward the empty living room. Tapamo. The indentations on the couch cushions marked where they had sat, where they had thrown their accusations, their demands, their pleas, and then left with nothing. For years, I had been the one leaving their house in silence, shrinking under the weight of their judgment. Tonight, they were the ones who left mine, heads bowed, shoulders hunched, their voices stolen. The shift was complete. I wasn't the one begging anymore. I wasn't the one erased. I was the one who ended it. I drew the curtains closed, shutting out the night, and let the silence of the apartment wrap around me. By January, the ripple had turned into a wave. I started hearing whispers at work from colleagues who followed the art scene in New York. Ethan's name came up in conversations not as the promising creative my parents once paraded around, but as someone blacklisted, a cautionary tale. Shows he had been banking on were quietly dropped. Invitations stopped coming. One by one, the opportunities that had inflated his ego dried up until there was nothing left. By March, a curator I knew through a patient mentioned it over coffee. "He's finished, Olivia. People don't want the headache, too much baggage." I nodded, hiding the complicated stir inside me. I hadn't lifted a finger. His unraveling was entirely of his own making. The same charm my parents worshipped had finally worn thin outside their four walls. By the summer of 2024, the cracks had spread further. My parents' house in Newton, the one with the wide porch and the garden Mom used to fuss over, was listed online. I found it by accident scrolling through a real estate app late one night. The photos looked staged rooms, stripped of personality, the fireplace bare where Ethan's painting once hung. I zoomed in and saw the faint shadow on the wall where it had been. The listing price was lower than I expected. Desperation clung to every word of the description. Motivated sellers priced to move. They couldn't carry the mortgage without my silent support, not anymore. By July, the house was sold. A young family with toddlers bought it, their plastic toys scattered across the lawn where Ethan and I once rode bikes. My parents moved into a modest rental across town, a place with no guest rooms, no space to host holidays. I didn't go by to see it. I didn't need to. The absence of the house itself was enough. It was the physical collapse of the pedestal they had built for Ethan, brick by brick, with my sacrifices wedged in between. Then, in December, a package arrived at my apartment. The envelope was thick, the handwriting looping and careful, my name written as though it had been practiced. I opened it at the kitchen counter, the steam from my mug of tea curling into the cold air. Inside was a letter, pages of it from Sienna, and tucked between them a photograph. She had taken it in Queens. Her grandmother Elma stood in a park sunlight cutting across her silver hair. She was in a yoga pose, arms lifted above her head, balanced steady, a smile stretching across her face. Behind her, trees stripped bare by winter, the sky pale blue. I read the words with my hands shaking. "She still remembers you," Sienna wrote. "She repeats your words whenever she gets scared. You're not done yet. You gave her more years. You gave me more time with her. Thank you." I pressed the photograph against my chest. My throat tightened, but this time the tears didn't feel heavy. They felt cleansing. The recognition, the gratitude, it wasn't about accolades or validation. It was about the truth. The truth my family had tried to erase had found its way back to me, handwritten in ink, carried in the steady breath of an old woman who was still standing because I hadn't given up on her. I found a frame that night, slipped the letter inside, and hung it by my desk. Every evening when I finished charting patient notes, my eyes landed on it. The photo of Elma. The words on the page, the reminder that my work had meaning far beyond what my parents were willing to see. Each day the frame caught the light differently. Sometimes it glowed golden in the morning sun, sometimes it dimmed into shadow by evening. But it was always there, steady, a quiet anchor. The snow fell heavier as December wore on, coating the streets in silence. I walked past families dragging trees into their houses, lights strung across porches, the smell of pine in the air. I felt no longing for the traditions I once tried to preserve. My Christmas had already arrived, sealed in an envelope, written in the careful hand of someone who saw me clearly, and for the first time I didn't need anything else. By the time December came around again, the city was buried under white. Boston looked hushed, as if the snow itself had pressed a finger to its lips. From my apartment window, I could see children dragging sleds down the hill across the street, their voices muffled by scarves and laughter. The whole block glittered under strands of lights strung across balconies, every window glowing like a small beating heart. Inside my apartment, the warmth wrapped around me like a blanket. The oven ticked softly as I slid a tray of gingerbread cookies onto the rack. The smell of cinnamon and molasses filled the air, richer than any perfume clinging to my sweater and hair. I brewed a pot of tea, the steam curling upward, fogging the glass of the window where I leaned for a moment, just watching the snowfall. The frame hung above my desk. The letter from Sienna, safe behind the glass, her handwriting looping across the page. The photograph of her grandmother stood tucked in the corner of the frame, her arms lifted in that yoga pose, smiling as if she carried the whole sky on her shoulders. I touched the edge of the frame lightly with my fingertips every time I passed, as if it were both a blessing and a reminder. I thought about the year that had passed. The gallery contracts that had dissolved the house in Newton sold to strangers. The silence that followed me after I drew the final line with my family. Not once had they called again. Not once had they knocked at my door. The quiet had once felt like an abyss, but now it was a gift, a wide-open space where I could finally breathe. I set the cookies on a cooling rack and poured tea into a chipped mug I'd had since med school. The apartment was small, modest, but every piece of it was mine. No expectations clung to the walls. No voices undermined me at the dinner table. It was just me, the tree in the corner glowing with soft gold lights, and the hum of peace. I pulled the green sweater over my head, the one I'd once folded so carefully, waiting to wear to a dinner that never wanted me. The fabric was soft against my skin, carrying none of the bitterness it once held. Tonight, it was just a sweater, warm and simple mine. The clock on the wall ticked past 6. Families across the city were gathering around tables, carving turkeys, unwrapping gifts. I imagined my parents in their rental across town, the rooms smaller, quieter, no holiday spread big enough to fill the gaps left behind. I pictured Ethan sitting somewhere alone, his phone buzzing with silence. His name shut out of the art circles he once believed he owned. The thought didn't bring triumph. It didn't need to. It was just the balance of things finally settling into place. I sank into the armchair by the window with my tea and let the warmth seep into my hands. Outside, the snow kept falling steady and patient, blanketing the sidewalks, muffling the tires of cars as they crawled along. The city carried on, and so did I. For years I had thought peace would come only with reconciliation, with apologies that never arrived. But the truth was simpler. Peace had come when I stopped waiting for them, when I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I had none. I looked at the lights on my tree, each one steady, unwavering. My voice filled the quiet of the room, low and sure. They chose to celebrate with my brother, and they lost everything. I chose the truth, and I found peace. The cookies cooled the tea, warmed me. The snow outside fell in silence. For the first time in my life, Christmas belonged to me. Have you ever had to step away from a family that refused to see you, not out of anger, but simply to protect your own peace? Share your story. I'd like to hear it.